What's up, everyone? We are diving back into the multiverse today for another epic. Which is what if Naruto became Dragon Champion and built Ultimate Harem with Anko X, Kurenai X Ayame X Tamari, and Tenten Part 3. If you enjoy this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more fanfics like this. Now, let's dive right into the fanfic. Kurenai was enjoying her own orgasm and was quite pleased and surprised when she felt Naruto's fill her body up once more, and she ed out in pleasure at the sensation of being filled to the brim once more by her lovers, and she spoke to Naruto. "You're very naughty, Naruto-kun. I love that, make me scream once more please." "With pleasure, Kurenai-chan." Naruto moved his slowly, and Kurenai relished the sensations as they flooded her nerves deeply, and she was enjoying this greatly, and she could see that Anko was also getting aroused once more as Naruto's actions allowed her Oris to do the very same thing to Anko's as well, and the Jonin smiled at that, and Kurenai did the very same thing as well. Kurenai ed out loudly as her S were once more being rubbed as well. Kurenai was happy to be able to feel her lovers once more inside of her body, and the pleasure that came with that feeling as well, and when Naruto picked up the speed and the pace in his thrusts, the red-eyed and raven-haired woman was even more pleased with the sensations that were flooding her body and her mind, and the fact that her Oris was also being pleasured made the whole thing all the more enjoyable for her at this moment. It was not long before both of them also reached their own limits, and both shouted at the very same time, and so did Anko, who joined the two of them screaming. Ah! Kurenai was able to feel her body being filled once more by her lover's thick and hot cum, and she relished the sensations deeply and lovingly. The fact that Anko came at the very same time was also very exciting for her, and the pleasure of it all made her feel very happy and very tired as she lay back to relax, and so did Anko, and the Jonin rolled off of her, and this allowed Naruto to kiss her and Anko, much to their combined happiness. Naruto looked at all four women, and the sight of their sweat-covered forms on his bed was very erotic, and the sight of his cum mixed with their respective juices coming out of their vagina was also very erotic to the eyes. But for now, they were resting, and thus he had enough time to turn his attention to the others. This was when all the kage bushin poofed away as the four mature women were resting, and that meant that from here on out, Naruto was in the lustful, passionate, and loving mercies of the younger Kunoichi, who loved him and he loved back. Naruto looked at them, and he could only smile as they were ready to make their move on him. Naruto could only watch as both Hinata, Sakura and Ino took turns kissing Anding his, while Tamari and Tenten were more than ready to give him a good show as the weapon mistress presented a chocolate cream-covered candy that she somehow had brought in and was somehow shaped like a rod, and despite the fact that the two of them were merelying the thing, the sight of it was sending the right signals down Naruto's brain as he looked on. Tenten and Tamari knew that what they were doing was more than enough to get Naruto's attention at full, and they smiled just as Ayame arrived with S bowl. Ayame then moved closer and whispered to the three girls, and they stopped and looked at Ayame and the others, and all of the four other girls blushed bright red at what the daughter of Tsuki had suggested, as they had never done that before and only Tamari and Tenten had. However, Ayame smiled, and that was enough to convince Sakura, Hinata and Ino, as well as Kin, to try this one idea out, and Ayame got this underway while Tsunade and the others were resting after their bouts with Naruto. This allowed Ayame to take out a special spoon and began to take out the contents of the bowl, which turned out to be sweet cream, and Naruto could only watch as Ayame decorated Sakura, Hinata, Ino, Tenten, Tamari, Kin, and then herself with the cream. Starting with their thighs, stomachs, and then their vagina. By the time Ayame was done, the seven younger Kunoichi, with Ayame being the eldest of the young group, were wearing cream with sweet food coloring on their bodes before Naruto. Quite the sight actually when one gets down to it all. Sakura had green and pink icing on her body, and she gave Naruto a smile as she had her legs parted and was smiling at Naruto. The different colored cream plus her skin tone made for a very delicious picture. Ino had cream on her body that had a mix of light golden yellow to match her hair and deep blue-green to match her eye color as well. That and the way Ino looked as she was sitting there with her legs parted and smiling lustfully at Naruto was very arousing. Kin was next with her cream covering matching her dark black hair and her eyes, making her look as if she was wearing a set of black undergarments, but of the easy to remove and very sweet tasting kind, and she knew it as she gave Naruto a seductive smile. Hinata had the cream that was covering her in the same color as her hair and her eyes, meaning the cream was a combination of dark indigo and deep silver white, and the sight of the shy and demure Hinata looking at him with that on and a deep blush in her face was very nice. All in all, it was a feast for the eyes as well as the imagination as Naruto walked over to them as they were all there before him, and the sight was certainly something that he was not going to forget anytime soon. Naruto made his move and went for Sakura and Hinata, and both women were smiling demurely at him, and he kissed them both in a three-way kiss, and he started buying off the cream on Sakura's right and then her left, all the while Sakura was enjoying it greatly, and he then did the same to her stomach. As soon as Sakura was bare of the cream covering her ass and stomach, Naruto did the same to Hinata, and she was enjoying the lovely sensations very much, and she hugged Naruto tightly for the sensations that were running through her ass when his tongue touched her ass and ass as well, and then the same with her stomach. The two then decided to try something, and Sakura allowed Hinata to be on top of her, and they presented both their cream-covered vagina to Naruto, and he was more than eager to clean them of their cream covering, and started with Hinata's first, and he ate out as he tasted something mixed with the cream, and that something was Hinata's own juices, and it made the whole thing all the more erotic for him. And he could see that some of the cream and cum from Hinata's vagina was making its way to Sakura's own, and that made him even more eager, and he took turns in cleaning Sakura and Hinata's vagina, anding up the cream that was mixed with their juices, and it was a very delicious mix. Both women ate out in joy and pleasure at Naruto's actions, and as soon as they were clean of the cream, the two of them kissed Naruto at the same time. The taste of cream and each other's taste was making all three of them blush deeply, and when the kiss ended, the two women wasted no time and both kneeled before Naruto, and they took turns in kissing his and on it, and it made him all the more aroused, and he made that fact very obvious to the two as he spoke to them. "This feels so good." The two agreed, and then Sakura moved to the bed, and so did Hinata, and the blonde Chunin watched as they took the same position, and they displayed their now cream-free vagina before him, and he needed no further invitation as he came closer and started with Sakura, and the pink-haired genin ate out in pleasure as Naruto began to push deeply, and as soon as he was deep inside of her he began to move and slowly as well to make her feel more comfortable. Naruto groaned out in pleasure and lust at the sensations as he continued to move his hips and slowly speeding up while playing with Hinata's S and kissing both of them at the very same time, and the pleasure for them was very good, and as Naruto sped up his actions, Sakura was screaming out in pleasure, and when Hinata turned her head, all of them had another three-way kiss, and it was not long before Sakura finally reached her limit and screamed out very loudly in her release. Ah! Sakura was in heaven as Naruto's cum filled her body once more, and she relished the feeling as it flowed into her body, and she spoke to Naruto, who was still deep inside of her at the moment and thrusting a bit more. "That felt so good, Naruto-kun." Naruto nodded and kissed her deeply as he relished the residual effects of Sakura's orgasm as his was still being caressed, and the feeling was very much welcome in his mind. He then turned his attention to Hinata and kissed her, and without pausing too fast, he pulled his out of Sakura's vagina and then slowly pushed into Hinata's own wet and eager. The Hyuga heiress was utterly pleased with the sensations that filled her, and she wanted more as Naruto drove deeply into her vagina, and she relished the feeling of being filled to the brim once again, and as soon as he was buried deep inside of her, she ate and spoke to Naruto. "Naruto-kun, I want it now, please don't make me wait." Naruto was more than willing to agree with Hinata's wishes, and he began to move his hips, and that was enough to make Hinata out loudly at the pleasure that was hitting her senses slowly, and Naruto moved slowly to make sure that he would be able to give as much pleasure as he could to her, and as soon as he could see Hinata's deep red blush on her face, it told him he was doing all right. Hinata ate out loudly, and then she kissed Naruto deeply as he began to pick up the pace. The slow and delicious feelings that Naruto invoked in her body were making her all the more happy that she was finally able to make love to him, and even though being with more people than just Naruto was a bit off, it was certainly not too bad, and she could get used to the situation at least. As Naruto picked up the pace, Hinata's breathing became more rapid, and Sakura played with Hinata's S to make things more enjoyable for the still shy Hyuga. And it was working well as Hinata was shouting out in wild abandon, totally unlike her meek, demure, and shy nature, and it was not very long before Hinata finally reached her own body's limits for pleasure and made that very obvious. Ah! Hinata felt Naruto's cum flood her body, and she relished the feel of it, and it amazed her that Naruto was still able to fill her to the brim despite all that he had been through ever since this night started, and it made her happy that he had enough energy to do this with her, and she made her happiness known to Naruto as she kissed him. The two lay back and relaxed, and the sight of Hinata and Sakura there on his bed with their bodies covered in sweat and their cum mixed with his there before him was very nice, and he then directed his attention to the other kunoichi who were more than eager for him to make his way to them, and he was more than willing to get over there and give them what they wanted. Ino and Kin were very eager for his actions, and they were not disappointed in the least as he began to clean their s at the very same time, and as soon as he was done, he kneeled down and took turns lapping off the cream that covered their respective, and the blonde chunin was able to get their tastes, and it was certainly something that he was going to seriously enjoy no matter the situation. Ino and Kin were happy as Naruto and them got into a three-way kiss, and they were able to taste one another well, and when that was over, Ino and Kin joined Sakura and Hinata on the bed, and this time, Kin was on top of Ino as the two kunoichi took the same position as that of Anko and Kurenai, and the sight of that was more than enough to get Naruto on the move as he joined the two on the bed. And this time, he focused on Ino and made his move. Ino was happy, and then she ed out even more the very second she felt Naruto's go deeply into her wet and eager, and Naruto did so slowly, and that allowed Ino to feel the sensations of Naruto's moving into her quite easily. She loved that, and as soon as Naruto began to move she was able to feel her auras being rubbed by Kin's own, and the feel of that was very much wanted by her, as well as the feel of her s and s being pleasured by Kin's own, and she ed out loudly alongside Kin as Naruto continued to move his hips. The two kunoichi were happy beyond belief as Naruto began to pick up speed in his actions, and Ino was drooling a bit as the pleasure of her auras and her s being rubbed the right way and her vagina being filled to the brim by Naruto, who thrust hard and deep into her, and it was not long before Ino finally reached her limit and she shouted out her pleasure, and right on time, Kin also came at the very same time, and both women came hard. Ino was in heaven as she felt her lover's cum flow into her vagina, and she loved the heat and thickness she felt inside of her, and as soon as Naruto began to relax, she smiled at him and spoke. Now that was good. Naruto smiled as he looked at Ino's vagina, and the sight of their combined juices was something that he found to be very much desirable, and he looked to see Kin's juices flowing out and mixing with their combined juices. He took that as a sign, and it was not long as he kissed Kin and at her earlobes, telling the kunoichi that it was going to be her turn this time, and she shivered in anticipation, and she didn't have to wait very long as Naruto made his move and slowly pushed his into her own dripping wet vagina, and she ed out loud and arched her back at the feel that it gave her. As soon as he was sure that she was ready, Naruto began to move his hips once more, and Kin ed out as she felt his move slowly in and out of her vagina, and the kunoichi loved it as her auras was being rubbed by Ino's own as well as his, and the pleasure proved to be very wonderful to her mind and body as she felt her body release even more of her juices at each and every thrust that Naruto gave to her body. Naruto held her hips and ran his tongue on her back while using his chakra to stimulate the nerves, namely the pleasure centers on her body, to make her orgasm all the more delicious. It didn't take very long for Kin to finally reach her limit as she came hard, and so did Ino as the blonde kunoichi also came at the very same time, and so did Naruto. Kin relished the sensations, and she could only smile shyly at Naruto, and he smiled back, and she felt very tired, and as he pulled away from Kin she moved off of Ino, and the two of them lay there, allowing Naruto to see them. The sight of the two kunoichi covered in sweat and the sight of his company equals mixed with their respective juices and coming out of their respective was highly arousing, and that gave Naruto the drive to look at the last three. Tenten, Temari and Ayame smiled and beckoned to Naruto. Temari, Tenten, and Anko were also more than ready for their rounds, and Naruto was more than willing to let them have their own rounds as well, and it seemed that all three of them were going to get their wish, and they were eager for that. Naruto cleaned Tenten and Temari's s first and then Ayame's s as well, and as soon as their s were clean, he moved to their stomachs, and as soon as they were clean, he made his next batch of targets to be their respective vagina and started with Temari's. The blonde sand kunoichi was more than willing to let Naruto clean her up, and she loved the feeling of her lover's skilled tongue covered in not just cream but chakra as well, and that further added to her pleasure of the situation, and she felt her juices come out, and seeing Naruto them all up was making her blush deeply, and she ed out even more. Naruto then got up and they kissed deeply, and Temari was more than happy with the resulting taste that was on her senses. As soon as he was done and swallowed the cream which had Temari's juices in them, he turned to Tenten and she smiled and parted her own thighs, and he wasted no time cleaning her up, and he once more tasted her juices mixed with the sweet cream, and the weapon mistress also loved the sensations and made that clear as she ed out loudly at the pleasure that was flooding her mind at the moment. As soon as Naruto was finished, The two kissed and Tenten blushed at tasting herself in the cream that was mixed with her Naruto-kun's own taste as well, a very delicious and arousing mix in her mind. Ayame was also eager for a chance to feel Naruto's love for her and his passion as well, and Naruto was more than happy to give her what she wanted, and he kneeled down and cleaned her vagina and thighs, and the brunette daughter of Tsuki was more than willing to let Naruto have his way with her, and as soon as he was done, the two kissed one another deeply, and she relished the fact that her taste was there with the cream as well as that of Naruto's. When they parted, Ayame her lips for Naruto's visual benefit, and he loved that, and he then directed his attention to Tenten. The weapon mistress of Konoha was more than willing to let Naruto have his way with her, and she was getting the benefits of being pleasured after all, so why complain? As soon as Naruto began to off the cream from her vagina, she was enjoying that well, and she enjoyed the sight of the blonde chunaning her and her thighs as well. And as soon as she was clean of the cream, the two of them kissed one another deeply, and she smiled at the taste of her own juices and the cream as well as the taste of her lover as well. As soon as he was done, all three women were all ready for him, and they moved near the bed and bent down, holding the bed and beckoning to Naruto with the shaking of their hips, and he replied and moved towards Ayame first, and he rubbed her S and then also Temari and Tenten's S as well, making all three of them smile out loudly at the pleasure that he gave them as he was using his chakra on his hands, and he then used his tongue as well, and kissing them in the areas where the pleasure centers were located, with his tongue being bathed in chakra. As soon as that was over, he pushed his deeply into Ayame, and the woman yelped at the sensations in a very pleasured fashion, and that was enough for Naruto to begin moving his hips slowly, much to Ayame's delight on the matter. She ed out loudly, and Naruto then used his still chakra-covered hands and played with Temari and Tenten's posteriors first, and then made his way to their wet and eager, and the second his fingers parted their outer lips and then into their wet inner sheaths, making both women out loudly as Naruto moved his in and out of Ayame slowly and did the same with his fingers, which were still covered in his chakra, and also the his to even things up for the three of them. Ayame ed out loudly as the pleasure grew, and Naruto continued to thrust faster, harder and deeper into her body, much to her pleasure and joy, while she was joined by Temari and Tenten as they were moving their hips in time with Naruto's movements of his fingers, and they enjoyed that as Naruto would move his fingers at certain angles, and in one moment, he was able to touch Tenten and Temari's most sensitive spots, making both out louder in time with his S movements in and out of Ayame's wet. It was not long before Ayame reached her limit and shouted out her pleasure, just as Temari and Tenten did, and so did Naruto, resulting in a four-way shout of pleasure at the very same time. Oh 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 h h h h h h h h h h. Ayame tensed her back in relaxed moments later as her orgasm was signing wave after wave of pleasure through every nerve of part of her body, and the feel of her lover's cum flowing into her vagina, and it was something that made her utterly happy that she was able to feel this once more in this day, and that was something that she wasn't going to forget as the thick and hot liquid flowed into her body. Naruto slowly moved out and then pushed his deeply into Temari, making the blonde Suna Kunoichi cum another time as the sensations had caught her off guard, and Naruto ed as he felt her inner walls caress his with great strength and movement, nearly making him cum again. But he held on and began to move his hips, and the pleasure that followed made Temari arch her back, and that allowed Naruto to play with her S and also her oris with his still chakra-covered fingers, and the pleasure from that was enough to make Temari out even more as Naruto made his move. Temari turned her head, and both her and Naruto kissed one another as the blonde Chunin continued to play with her S and oris while moving his in and out of her vagina in a much faster pace, and as the two continued on their actions, it was not long before both Tenten and Ayame got into the act as Tenten played with Temari's S while Ayame did the same to her oris, that in Naruto's as it continued to move in and out of Temari's. Temari was finally hitting her limit and came fast and hard with a scream. Ah! Temari was in heaven as she felt her lover's cum flow into her body once more, and the two had a parting kiss from one another, and Naruto moved away, and that allowed Temari and Ayame to rest for the time being on the floor, and that left Tenten along with Naruto, and she was more than willing to let her lover have his way with her any way he liked. Naruto did just that and moved to Tenten and kissed her deeply, and then played with her S with his hands, making her as he touched her S in the way he knew she liked them to be touched by him, and that made Tenten all the more aroused. And when Naruto pushed his into her, the brown-haired weapon mistress of Konoha shouted out as she held onto the bed and wrapped her legs around Naruto's hips and held him tight. Naruto was more than ready and began to move his hips and did so slowly, and Tenten ed out at the sensations that were being sent through her body at the moment, and it was something she relished deeply. And as Naruto leaned down to kiss her and then her she ed even more and she reveled deeply in it all. Naruto picked up the pace and he smiled at the sight of Tenten's moving up and down on her sweat-covered form, her face flushed with red, her breathing being ragged and more, plus the feel of her vaginal walls milking his with each thrust he made was more than worth it, despite the fact that he was already reaching his natural limits, and he pressed on to make sure that Tenten had all the pleasure she could handle and then some. Tenten screamed after many minutes of this as she came hard, and so did Naruto as he too reached his very own limits. Tenten lay back on the bed satisfied and happy as she felt her lover's cum flood into her body once more, and the warmth of it all made her all the more relaxed and happy as she rested on the bed. Naruto was flat out tired. He then made his way to his bed and decided to rest a bit, and so did the 11 other women in his room. What they had all done at that moment was one run they were not going to forget anytime soon. However, Naruto had no idea that this was just the early festivities. 3 hours later, Naruto lay on his bed and felt like he was going to die and go straight to heaven right there and now. The smell of was so thick in his room, he was amazed that he was still able to be alive. He had cum so many times he lost count ever since this night started, and he couldn't help but feel more drained, and he phrased what he felt in one way. Now I know how a squashed sponge feels. Naruto barely managed to get his energy back as he looked to see all 11 women who were with him at the moment getting up, and all of them were stretching and smiling all the while. Hinata was moving her arms back a bit and she slyly smiled at Naruto while she was still very much. Naruto-kun's up already. Naruto gulped as all the women in his room were done stretching to relax themselves, and then Shizune, Tsunade, and Sakura moved towards him and then used the medical jutsu to heal him and allow him to recover more of his stamina, and as soon as he felt his body being back to full power, Ayame, Kin, and Tenten left the room, and Naruto was confused to what the three of them were up to at the moment. He got his answer when a table was brought in and some of the food was there, and his stomach growled at the smell, and the same could be said for the others. Naruto, Tsunade, Anko, Sakura, Kurenai, Hinata, Shizune, Ayame, Ino, Tenten, Temari, and Kin were quick to eat the food, and as soon as that was over, the women decided to meditate for the time being as Naruto could only gasp as he was taken out of his home, and Tsunade revealed that she had placed a special ceiling barrier around the house with her chakra to dampen sound and hide the home from any prying eyes, and not even an Anbu squad could break through this genjutsu, further amazing the blonde Chunin at how capable Tsunade was, and making Sakura wish to learn as much as she could manage from the Hokage. What are? Tsunade smiled and replied, "Don't worry Naruto-kun, this is another way to make love with the woman, or in this case, women you happen to be very close to, and there's something utterly wild about doing it in the wild open spaces, don't you think? You can't be serious. Out here, oh yes, and don't worry, my barriers have never failed yet, even Jiraiya cannot break them." Naruto tried to protest, but his words fell on deaf ears as all the women had agreed with the idea proposed amazingly enough by Hinata herself. The very second she had suggested that they allow Naruto to make love to them in the wide open spaces, every woman, even Tsunade, looked wide-eyed at the shy Hyuga heiress, who had just suggested what was the most scandalous plan in seduction in history. Before Naruto could say anything to try and fix this situation, Hinata and Sakura walked over to him, and before he could say anything, the two kunoichi pushed him into the nearby pool of water, and he was now wet, and the two kissed him, silencing his protests, and the 9 other women made their move to grab him, and Naruto could only prepare himself as best he could as the women were going to drive him off the wall once more. As he was placed into the deeper part of the water up to halfway to his thighs, Naruto stopped at the nearby rock, and that was the signal for the women to pounce on him, and he could barely react at the moment as the others were more than ready to make their move towards him. He was kissed by both Hinata and Sakura, and then they moved to the sides while Temari moved to his and began to it with great gusto, and the fact that he was making love to Gaara's sister was making Naruto all the more aroused at the feeling before him as the blonde Suna Kunoichi continued to his, and it was also when Tenten joined in and began to Naruto's testicles as both of them were enjoying the situation greatly. As soon as the lip lock was done, and Temari and Tenten were back to being aroused once more at full throttle, Naruto looked back to see Kurenai lying on the shallower water, with her legs parted and lying on s soft and clean grass-covered part of the pool with her legs parted, revealing her very wet and eager vagina, while Tsunade was on one side and with Anko on the other. The smiles on the three Jonins' faces were enough to tell Naruto just what was they wanted from his at the moment, and now he was more than willing to give it to them at this moment as he made his way to Kurenai and then deeply kissed the red-eyed woman and then began to slowly push his into her vagina, and Kurenai ed out loudly at the pleasure that was flooding her senses. Naruto held Kurenai's legs and placed them over his shoulders to make it a bit easier for him to hold on to her, and the red-eyed woman was more than eager for him to push his right into her very core as she relished the thought of it and the memories of how it felt when they had been together before. The red-eyed woman smiled and Naruto kissed her deeply, much to her pleasure and desire, and as soon as the intense lip lock was over, Naruto began to move his hips in and out of Kurenai's wet vagina, and the red-eyed woman loved every second of it as she looked at her lover moving on top of her. Naruto-kun, harder, right there. Yes. The two continued to pleasure one another while the others watched, and they were getting very eager to be doing this. Hinata herself was getting even more eager to have Naruto as well, but she knew that they had plenty of time together at this moment and there was no need to rush things, so she merely looked on as her lover was busy making love to her sensei. It was a bit surprising, but Hinata was a kind lady who wanted everyone to be happy, and Kurenai was certainly happy being with Naruto right now. She knew that her turn would come and she was more than willing to wait. Kurenai ed out loudly as Naruto played with her and also and ed them, and she was feeling his fill her to the core, and it was an undeniably delicious sensation had filled her to the very core of her bones, and she knew that this was going to be one night she was not going to forget anytime soon, and she was going to take in as much as she could at this moment. Naruto was in the same boat as he played and ed Kurenai's with all the energy he had at this moment and time. He twirled his tongue on her deep red and the sounds of Kurenai's were more than enough to tell the blonde chunin that he was doing well, and the feel of Kurenai's tight, wet, and soft vaginal walls caressing and milking his at this moment was making him all the more heated and bothered. Naruto-kun, Kurenai-chan. The two roared out their words as they both orgasmed, and Kurenai arched her back as she once more felt Naruto's hot, thick and sweet-tasting cum flood her womanhood to the brim. She would never get tired of that and was happy that she had taken her medication, as now was not yet the time to have children, at least not yet. She would be more than happy to be married soon, and she already knew she would pick her lover for her husband, but there had to be some planning first before it could work out between her and Naruto. For now she would relish her time with him for as long as she could, and as soon as things were in a much better situation and time. The two were ing out loud while the others were busy making themselves hot and eager. Naruto might not have made any cage bushin, but that hardly meant that the women were not able to find their own way to pleasure themselves at the moment, and the sight of them playing with either their and vagina, but each other's as well with their hands, mouths, and tongues was very erotic. Naruto and Kurenai continued to make love to one another until Kurenai finally reached her limits and screamed out. Naruto-kun. Naruto also reached his own limit at the very same time as he screamed in his release. Kurenai-chan. Kurenai ed out loudly as she was flooded by the feeling of her orgasm and then the feel of Naruto's cum once more flooding her vagina to the very core of her womanhood and body. It was a sensation that she would never get tired of, and considering how quickly Naruto could learn many things, he would no doubt be easy to teach in the ways on how to pleasure her. She looked forward to that. Naruto ed as he felt his being milked hard by Kurenai's inner walls, and as soon as he was done, he slowly pulled out of her vagina and he kissed her deeply, and Kurenai smiled warmly and kissed him right back, and she whispered to Naruto. Time to be with the others, Naruto-kun. Thank you so much for every moment with you. Why, you're welcome. I hope to make it up to you soon. I'll wait for that time, Naruto-kun. Naruto wasted no time and made a beeline to Hinata, who was closing her eyes as she was on the grass a fair distance away, and the Hyuga heiress had no time to react when Naruto made his move and moved to her vagina as she was there on the ground lying down with her legs parted, and she was laying on the ground with a mound of dirt and grass as a pillow for her head. The Hyuga heiress was playing with herself with her hands when Naruto moved up to her, and then she screamed out in pleasure and surprise when Naruto'd her vagina and her as well as her fingers. Kya. Hinata looked and saw Naruto, who was right there before her with a love, lust and passion all over his face as he kissed her nose gently, almost cutely, and she then responded by blushing bright red, and he smiled and kissed her deeply once more, allowing her to taste her own moisture as well. The two kissed each other, and as soon as the kissing was over, Naruto made his way back to her vagina and heat her vaginal lips and then her oris, making Hinata out even louder in pleasure and joy. Naruto'd her vagina and then pushed his tongue deeply into Hinata's wet and tight, and the Hyuga heiress was more than happy as she ed and squirmed at the sensations that were flooding her body at this moment and time. Naruto'd and ed on Hinata's wet vagina and also her oris, and as soon as she arched her back in orgasm, he knew that his actions on his lover had finally borne fruit. Naruto-kun. Naruto felt the increase of Hinata's wetness and he lapped up as much as he could take and then pushed his tongue deep into Hinata's wet vagina, and he ed mentally as he felt the way her inner walls would touch and caress his tongue, and the memory of how it felt all around his made Naruto all the more aroused, and his twitched hard at the sensations that were hitting him. As soon as he could tell that Hinata had reached her limit and was recovering from her orgasm, he lifted her body and sat down on the grass, and using his chakra and dragon fire to increase his stamina and strength, he moved to position Hinata over his, and as soon as she was looking at him with her eyes muddled deeply in pleasure, he slowly lowered her to his, which was rock hard and eager. Ah! Hinata gasped out loudly as the young Hyuga heiress felt her lovers enter her wet and eager vagina once more, and as soon as she felt it go deeply into her all the way to her womb, she ed out loudly at the pleasure that flooded her senses, and then she looked at Naruto with a deep blush, and then they kissed one another as Hinata found the strength to move her body and her hips up and down Naruto's own lap, and as she felt her inner walls rub around his, she was in heaven once more. The two continued to move, and as soon as she felt her energy come back to her, Hinata began to move on her own, and Naruto leaned back and play with Hinata's s while lying down, and Hinata was enjoying this as she moved her hips as best she could in order to take in all the pleasurable sensations that were flooding her body and give them same pleasure to her lover and long-time crush. And her actions were effective as Naruto was enjoying the sensations of her vaginal walls milking his through the movements of her moving hips, and the pleasure was making him react as he too began to move his hips in time with Hinata's own movements, and the pleasure mounted for the two of them until both came at the very same time. Naruto-kun. Hinata-chan. Hinata arched her back as she felt her body once more being filled with her lover's cum, and the feeling of the hot and thick liquid filling her body in every fashion was utterly wanton and lustful to Hinata as she was drooling a bit, and she looked back to see the very same expression on Naruto's face at this moment. Naruto likewise was in heaven as he felt Hinata's inner walls milk his long and hard, and the sensations were utterly delicious to him as he looked at Hinata's face, which was covered in sweat and flushed red by her blush, and he couldn't help but find it utterly desirable at this moment, and he reached to her and deeply kissed Hinata, and she responded in kind, and when the kiss was over, Hinata spoke with all her heart. Naruto-kun. I love you so much. I love you. Hinata-chan. As they moved away, Hinata lay back on the grass, and it was when Naruto was greeted by Anko, who crawled up to him from behind, and then she ran her hands on his back and then kissed him when he turned to face her. The kiss was deep and strong, and Anko gently nipped Naruto's lip to draw some of his blood, and she took it in and loved the taste, and Naruto's healing took over, healing the cut in mere moments. As soon as the kiss was over, Anko spoke. Now let's have some fun, Naruto-kun. Anko gave Naruto no warning as she moved forward and pushed him down to the ground, and she then straddled his head and was facing his, and she leaned down and was now facing his while her wet vagina was exposed to Naruto. She smiled and then spoke to him. Me Naruto-kun. Naruto nodded and did just that, and Anko ed out in pleasure and rewarded Naruto's actions buying the tip of his and then the sides and then the base of his and the shaft as well. The pleasure for her as Naruto'd her vagina and oris was very much welcomed, and she gave back the very same pleasure to her lover and then reached for his balls with her hands, and she took in the sensitive orbs and played with them both with her lips and her tongue, making Naruto do the same thing as he pushed his tongue deeply into her vagina. Naruto then tried to use his chakra to stimulate her inner walls through his tongue, and the very second he did that, Anko was ing out in pleasure, and she then released his for a brief moment as she screamed as he touched her G-spot, the supposed area where the woman felt the greatest level of pleasure. Anko ed out loudly as she felt her body release more of her juices to reward Naruto for his efforts. Nice one, Naruto-kun, I'll have to pay you back. And Anko did just that as she took Naruto's deeply into her mouth and began to move her head up and down, whiling and humming to add to the pleasure that Naruto was currently feeling at this point and time. As soon as she was able to get Naruto-ing and groaning out loudly in pleasure, the Jonin made her move as she slowly got off Naruto and then lay on the grass next to him and smiled as she parted her legs and made a come here gesture to her lover. Naruto was quick to grasp her invitation and then placed her feet on his shoulders, and Anko growled playfully. Go on, Naruto-kun, ravish me, make me yours. Naruto needed no further invitation and began to move his hips, and his was now sliding in and out of Anko's tight, soft, and wet vagina, and the sounds of his moving in and out of her vagina and the and cries of pleasure coming out his lover's mouth was making Naruto as the more aroused as he held onto Anko's hips and legs for greater control and movement. Anko appreciated this greatly and was playing with her with her hands, and she ed out her pleasure as she felt each thrust of Naruto's hips, and the feel of her lovers moving in and out of her inner core was even more welcome. Harder. Faster. Yes. Anko-chan. They moved with one another, and Naruto the Ned Anko's thighs and her calves, running his tongue there and using his chakra to pleasure Anko's nerves and the pleasure of his actions, both with his chakra-coated tongue caressing her nerves in pleasure, and the feel of his moving in and out of her vagina was making Anko all the more frenzied in pleasure. She had no idea why she was feeling this way towards Naruto, but she was not in the mood to complain in the least, and she continued relish the pleasure. Naruto then reached with his hands to her and he played with her and as best he could, using the same method with his chakra, and touched the areas he knew would make Anko even more aroused. He knew that Ankos were not that sensitive, but they were very much eager for the touch as he saw her harden and pucker up with his touch. That made him all the more eager to hear Anko scream his name. Anko was crying out in pleasure, and she felt tears of pleasure flow down her eyes, and she looked at Naruto and smiled at him as she had her face flushed in red as she was overwhelmed by the pleasure that was flooding her senses and making her all the more happy. The Jonin never wanted to have this pleasure and joy replaced by anything, and she vowed that if ever she was on an assignment with her lover, she would do her absolute best to keep him safe. Naruto likewise saw the pleasure and bliss on Anko's face, and the sight of her being drowned in the pleasure he was giving her right now made Naruto even more eager to make her scream out in pleasure. The fact that she was Orochimaru's former student didn't bother him. He could feel that Anko had no ties to the snake-summoning bastard at all, and she was free in her own right, and he vowed that no harm would befall her as long as he lived in this world. The two continued to pleasure one another, and Anko was already screaming in bliss, caring little if anyone heard her, and Naruto was also screaming his pleasure, and then the two of them reached their limits. Naruto-kun. Anko-chan. Anko wailed her orgasm as she felt her vagina being filled to the brim with her lover's cum, and as she felt the hot and thick fluid fill her body's deepest corners and areas, she blushed even more as she felt the waves of pleasure floor her body, as well as she saw the pleasure etched on Naruto's face. She loved it, and the moment they were going to be alone, she was more than willing to make him out once more. Naruto looked at Anko and saw the look of orgasmic pleasure in her eyes, and the deep blush on her face made her all the more beautiful in a very wild and primal way. He saw the heavy breathing she was going through as her chest and moving up and down. He loved the feel of her inner walls caressing and milking his, and the feel of her moisture flooding out and coating his made him very happy, and his was now back to full force. He pulled out his and lowered Anko's legs, and he kissed her as she responded with greater intensity, and as soon as they parted, the Jonin smiled at him and spoke. I love you, Naruto-kun. I want you so badly. Anko-chan. Naruto smiled as Anko closed her eyes to rest peacefully, and it was then that a seductive voice came to his ears. Naruto-kun, come here. Naruto turned, and there was Tsunade, who was still there in the water, which was up to her knees at the moment. And the way the blonde Hokage was smiling told Naruto volumes of what she wanted from him at this moment. Tsunade smiled and moved to lean on a nearby boulder in the water with her back facing Naruto, and she parted her legs and gave a shake of her hips to invite Naruto over. The blonde Hokage didn't have to wait too long, as Naruto quickly reached her and placed his hands on her hips, as Tsunade was very wet and very eager for this moment. She wanted to do this ever since Hinata suggested this idea, and Naruto was not disappointing her as he thrust his deep into her wet and eager vagina. Ah, Tsunade-chan. Tsunade ed out loudly at the feeling of being filled by Naruto's once more. It was something she couldn't get enough of, and she loved it a lot. Naruto was a very good man, and the fact that he was compassionate, generous and very capable made this night all the more wonderful to her senses at this moment. She felt Naruto ease deeply into her, and the feeling of being filled to the limit was a sensation she was not going to forget at this moment as she got ready for the soon-to-come pleasure, and Naruto was not disappointing her as he thrust hard into her wet vagina, and the pleasure was great for her as Naruto slowly started moving to get used to this for a moment or two. As soon as he was used to the position, Naruto quickly picked up speed and the results of his actions were obvious as Tsunade was ing out loudly in pleasure and bliss and he reached her S and held the luscious and large orbs of flesh on his lover's body and he used his chakra to pleasure her S. Tsunade ed out loudly at that and gave Naruto a speech filled with pleasure and lust. That's it Naruto-kun, play with my body, make me yours, right here and now. The blonde Chunin was more than willing to go at full power and full steam and his movements began to increase as he held onto Tsunade who was more than willing to let him have his way with her. After all, she had done the very same thing to him and she wanted to be fair to her lover to let him have full control of his actions with her right here and now. Naruto was not disappointing her in the least as he continued to thrust deeply into her and she leaned down a bit more to make sure that he was deeply moving his in her vagina and the pleasure was all the more delicious and real at this position. Tsunade felt the coolness of the air and the stone as well and the feeling of Naruto's thrusting in and out of her vagina was sending waves of hot pleasure and sensation through her body, from her hips all the way to her head and toes. It was good. Tsunade-chan. Harder Naruto-kun. The blonde Chunin moved faster and thrust deeper into his lover's body and Tsunade was enjoying this oneness with Naruto with every fragment of her body as each thrust of his into her vagina made her even happier. She relished this moment and all those she spent being with Naruto, who gave her a chance to live again. And she loved him, deeply, not like a little brother, not anymore, but as a man who was not only a very handsome fellow, but had the right qualities to be a great future leader, and the physical aspects were just as good. It was not long before the two of them finally reached their own limits as the both of them came fast and hard. Naruto-kun. Tsunade-chan. The blonde Hokage and Sanin ed out with pleasure and bliss as she felt her vagina being once more filled with her lover's cum. The hot and thick liquid essence of her lover felt wonderful to her senses as it flowed into her. She knew that by all rights, she would have already gotten pregnant. Naruto moved away as Tsunade turned around and leaned back on the boulder and he could see the traces of her juices which had his cum mixed in it as well and he leaned forward and kissed Tsunade who was more than happy to kiss him back and the feel of her body got him even more excited and Tsunade gasped a bit as they parted as she felt his touch her body and she smiled and spoke slowly as the pleasure had dulled her senses. You are so energetic Naruto-kun, I love that. Tsunade-chan. I think there are others waiting too, go on. Naruto smiled and turned to see none other than Shizune who was standing there. Still awake and she was touching her dripping wet vagina at the sight of her master Tsunade being ravished by the man they all loved with all their heart. The blonde Chunin moved towards her and kissed her, making her look at him in surprise. The kiss became more torrid as Naruto hugged Shizune and felt her form with his once again and he was more than ready to make Shizune out in pleasure and shout his name in all of her passionate abandon. As soon as that was over, Naruto guided Shizune to the ground and made her face away from him and kneel on the ground and she placed her hands on the ground as well and as soon as she did so, Naruto moved closer and began to kiss Shizune's vagina and he even rubbed her butt with his hands, making Shizune out loudly. Naruto-kun. Naruto continued to run his tongue up and down Shizune's vagina and Oris and as soon as he was rewarded with more of Shizune's juices and the sounds of her S and shouts of pleasure, he made his move to finally give Shizune what both of them wanted and he kissed his way to the back of Shizune's neck by kissing her backbone all the way to her shoulder blades while running his hands on her hips and thighs, making the Jonin squirm at the sensations that he was giving her at this moment and she proved it true as she laughed a bit. Naruto-kun, that tickles. I know. Are you ready Shizune-chan? Yes. With that to tell him that she was more than willing, Naruto pushed his right into her eager and waiting which was eager to feel him once more. Shizune ed out loudly as she was once more filled to the brim with her lovers and it made her arch her back in pleasure. Naruto replied by leaning downward and wrapped one of his arms around Shizune's body and touched her S and he used his other hand to make Shizune turn and the two of them kissed one another deeply and their tongues dueled with one another and as soon as the two were finished kissing with one another, Shizune let her tongue out and so did Naruto and their tongues touched each other's and the two loved this intimate duel and when it was over, Shizune relaxed and when she did, that was the signal for Naruto to slowly move his hips while she held on the ground on her hands and knees. Shizune moved her own body in time with Naruto's hips and that allowed her to feel each thrust as Naruto moved faster and thrust his even deeper than before and the pleasure for them both was getting even more intense and both Shizune and Naruto howled out in pleasure and joy as they were reaching their very limits. Naruto reached down and both he and Shizune kissed one another deeply as they both came at the very same time. The two did not break their kiss with one another and ate deeply in each other's mouths for the duration of their orgasms. Shizune ate as she kissed Naruto deeply with their tongues as she felt her vagina being once more filled with her lover's thick and hot cum, and the feel of it finally drained her of her energy as she parted from Naruto and she smiled at him and spoke. I love you, Naruto-kun. I know. The two had one more lingering kiss before Shizune rested on the soft and comfortable grass. Naruto Bear had time to react or rest when he was hugged by another woman, and when he turned about to see who it was Ayame herself who kissed him deeply and ran her hands on his form and touched his, and despite having touched it and more, Ayame blushed at the feel of it in her hands once more. Showing that despite revealing her more wanton and kinky side and losing her virginity to her lover, she was still very much a virgin at heart, something that Naruto hoped she would not lose no matter the changing situation, as it was something that made Ayame very attractive in his eyes. The two kissed one another and Naruto relished her ness as despite not being a ninja, she was fit and strong, as well as very lithe and slender. Ayame was also well formed and the feel of her full and well formed S on his chest was very nice, and as for Ayame, she gasped a bit as she felt Naruto's on her thigh and she parted her thighs a bit and was rewarded with the feel of her lover's on her pubic hair and touching ever so faintly her oris, and she ed out loudly at the sensation. Ayame-chan, you are eager Oh yes. Come now Naruto-kun, I want to feel you inside me again. Naruto agreed and he lifted Ayame up into his hands, and despite feeling his body being somewhat drained of its normal strength due to coming so many times already, he was able to reach his forge, and there on the wall, Naruto made his move as he made Ayame lean on the wall. He then began to kiss her even more and moved down to her neck and he'd and led on her S, making Ayame all the more aroused, and he tasted remains of the cream she had used before back in the bedroom. He grinned at the memories while continuing to pleasure Ayame's S, and he kneeled down, kissing anding her stomach and then her thighs, which she willingly parted, and as soon as he was clear, he'd her dripping wet vagina, making Ayame gasp in pleasure, and he continued to kiss her there, and then Naruto got up and lifted one of her legs, and as soon as he was able to position himself properly, he pushed in and was rewarded by sliding deep into Ayame's eager vagina. Ah! Ayame was ing out loudly as Naruto kissed her deeply as he pushed his deep into her vagina once more, and the woman ed as they stood together and she leaned on the nearby wall of the forge. The place was not used yet, but right now, the situation was going to be a lot of fun, and as soon as Naruto thrust deeply into her wet vagina, Ayame ed even more as she felt her inner self being filled to the brim by her lovers. Ayame and Naruto continued on with their actions as Naruto moved slowly at first so as to make sure that Ayame was not being hurt and was comfortable in her position, as the last thing he wanted was to hurt her in any fashion, and as soon as Ayame said that she felt fine he began to pick up speed and rhythm, and the result proved to be worth every moment as Ayame was screaming and ing out his name in utter lust and bliss. Naruto busied himself by using his chakra, which he directed into his hands and tongue in order to pleasure her body. Ayame was in heaven. She had come many times since this night and she was drunk in the pleasure of it all and wanted to finally reach her limits as Naruto continued to thrust hard and deep into her inner sheath. The pleasure drove her to breaking point, and the same could be said for her lover as Naruto continued to pick up the pace. It was not long before the two of them reached their respective limits. Ayame-chan. Naruto-kun. Ayame ed loudly and her head lay to the side as she felt Naruto's cum flood her body once more, and it was utterly delicious to her to feel the hot and thick liquid of her lover fill every corner of her body. She wanted the memory to last as long as she lived, and she loved Naruto, and she vowed that when the time was right, she was going to marry him. It was going to be hard, but Tsunade-sama had worked this all out already, so having her marry Naruto as well as share him with the others shouldn't be a problem. As they parted from one another, Ayame smiled and kissed Naruto once more, and he helped her sit down and she spoke to him in an exhausted but very happy voice. Thank you Naruto-kun, that was so good. Ayame-chan. Naruto turned and was then kissed on the lips by none other than Sakura, who had followed them and had seen this, and she was more than ready to have her turn once more with Naruto, and she could feel her vagina dripping wet with the anticipation. Naruto kissed her back, and as they stayed together and then as they parted, Naruto touched Sakura's S and then made his way to her dripping wet vagina and played with the outer lips and her oris with his hands and used his chakra to pleasure her. And she replied in kind using the very same thing, and both of them ed as they kissed each other once more. As soon as they were done kissing, Sakura moved away and then got to a nearby stone and parted her legs, allowing Naruto to see her vagina, which was very wet, and she gave a come here gesture that Naruto wordlessly obeyed. And she spoke to him as she hugged him. Now, I want you now, Naruto-kun. Naruto nodded and without saying a word further, pushed his deeply into Sakura's vagina, and he had no trouble in that regard as he slid in easily. Sakura ed out loudly and she wrapped her legs around Naruto's waist as she looked at her lover and smiled lustfully and passionately at his face, and they both kissed one another, and then Naruto began to move his hips, making Sakura out even louder in pleasure at the sensations that were flooding her body thanks to her lover's actions, and she was more than eager to feel those said sensations. The pink-haired kunoichi ed out loudly as Naruto started slowly and then began to pick up speed and rhythm, and as soon as that was done, she was shouting out her pleasure and Naruto did likewise. Sakura-chan. Naruto_kun. Harder. Faster. Naruto did just that, and Sakura was shouting out her pleasure as she was being filled by her lovers all over again, and the sensations were driving her wild with passion and desire as she and Naruto kissed one another yet again. The kissing lasted for a while as their tongues dueled with one another as Naruto thrust his hard, fast and deep into Sakura's eager body. It was not very long before the two of them would also reach their own limits, and the two of them shouted at the very same time. Ah! The results were worth it in Sakura's mind as she felt her vagina once more being filled by her lover's cum. The thick and hot cum was flowing her body once more, and it was delicious to her senses, and she then looked at Naruto and gave him a deep and loving kiss for all he had done for her and how she would be with him whenever he needed help. A lot had changed between them, and the day she gave him her virginity was the day she would never look at him the same way ever again. As they parted, Naruto allowed Sakura to go down off the large stone and sit on the grass, and they kissed one another, and as he turned, there was Kin, who was blushing and she was eager to be with him, and he could see the juices that were flowing out of her vagina. The sight was enough for Naruto, and he moved towards Kin, and then without saying a single word, he kissed her deeply and she responded in kind. The two kissed one another deeply, and it was not long that after the kiss, the former sound kunoichi spoke to Naruto. I am ready, make me happy. Are you ready for this? Kin was more than ready for this as she held onto Naruto's shoulders and he lifted her up, and she quickly wrapped her legs around his waist, and she ed out even more as she felt his dive deeply into her vagina, and the dark-haired kunoichi was loving the feel of her lovers being deep inside of her body and vagina once more. As she got used to this position, the dark-haired kunoichi began to move her hips, and the blonde-haired chunin was more than willing and ready as he moved his hips to thrust deeply into her body, and Kin was in love with it. It amazed her that Naruto, despite coming how many times, was still able to have the strength to pleasure her and make her feel the joy she wanted and felt when he was around. And that made her all the more loving towards him. As Naruto continued to pick up the pace, the kunoichi ed out in pleasure and she hugged Naruto, not wanting to be parted from him for any reason, and she then kissed him deeply, and Naruto responded by thrusting even deeper and harder into Kin and then kissing her back with greater passion and lust. The two finally shouted out in deep pleasure as they continued with their movements with one another. Ah, Naruto-kun. Kin finally reached her limit after several more fast-paced and deep thrusts. She came just as Naruto did. Naruto-kun. Kin-chan. Naruto managed to control himself as his orgasm flooded his body and he nearly felt like he was going to fall down. He stood up and used his dragon fire and chakra to regain his physical strength and held Kin tightly as she was still in the throes of passion and release and the feel of her inner walls massaging and milking his. Kin was in heaven as she felt her lover's cum flood her body, and she couldn't help but out as the hot and thick cum flooded her body, and she couldn't help but kiss Naruto, and vowing that after all he had done, she would do anything to keep Naruto alive and happy to the best of her abilities. Naruto also felt his being caressed by the inner walls of his lover who he had saved from committing suicide. Even though it had been some time, it still made him angry at how she had been treated in her own village, and also what could have happened if Orochimaru had decided to use her as an expendable tool for his own desires and plans. He vowed to make Orochimaru pay 100 times over for all the people he had hurt, mistreated and killed, including Sarutobi, but he placed those thoughts aside and focused on the pleasure that Kin gave him, and he gave her, and they kissed one another. Kin then spoke to Naruto with a tearful smile. Thank you, For saving me. I love you, Naruto-kun. Kin then slept as she unwrapped her legs from Naruto's waist and Naruto gently lowered her to the ground and she went there to rest for the time being. That allowed Naruto to relax for a bit and then he was greeted by none other Ino who was smiling at him as she walked towards him and that began to hug him deeply while rubbing her S on his chest and she moved Naruto towards his forge and then she leaned back on the wall and Naruto smiled. The two kissed one another deeply and as soon as that was over, Naruto moved down as he kissed her neck, then her chest as well as her S, playing with her S with the use of his tongue and then he made his way to her stomach, caressing her hips and thighs with his hands and then moved to her dripping wet vagina and the blonde Chunin smelled her scent on her blonde fur below her and between her thighs and it seemed that Ino trimmed that well and Ino gasped at Naruto's actions and replied. Oh, Naruto-kun, you smell nice, ready for this? Ino nodded and Naruto got up slowly and then lifted both Ino's legs by the knee and she was able to hold onto some support beams and she could only gasp out in absolute pleasure as Naruto lifted her lower body up a bit to cradle her legs in his arms and he then pushed his deeply into her dripping wet vagina with a full thrust. Ah, Naruto-kun. Ino held onto the posts as she knew that she needed to hold onto something, but that changed as Naruto moved a bit closer and held the most of her body's weight with his own arms and she only had to lean back and she held tightly as Naruto began to move his hips and he leaned down to kiss her deeply. Ino was in heaven as this allowed her to feel every deep and hard thrust of Naruto's in her dripping wet and eager vagina. The two blonde Konoha ninja were relishing the pleasure as Naruto continued to move his hips and when the two of them broke their kiss for some air, the two looked at one another and he could see that Ino's blush was deep red. So much so that she looked like her cheeks were on fire and the pleasure no doubt was making her all the more happy and that was what Naruto wanted to make her happy, and Ino was more than willing to show just how much she was enjoying the whole situation as she ate out and then she stuck out her tongue and Naruto responded and they allowed their tongues to dance with one another and then they kissed once more as Naruto continued to thrust deeply into Ino's wet vagina and the pleasure for her and him was worth every second that they spent in this position despite the fact that she could see that Naruto was getting somewhat tired by this. She wanted to reason with him but the pleasure made her forget that idea and the two of them were more than willing to keep going. It was then that the two of them came at the very same time. Naruto-kun. Ino-chan. Ino was in heaven as she felt her lover's cum fill her once more and she relished the heat and thickness of it as she also recalled the sweetness of it all and that was enough to make Ino blush at the thought of how much closer she had gotten being with Naruto. Back then she would not even look at him, but after all that had happened, she would never look at another man, and losing her virginity to Naruto made him the only man she wanted. Naruto was also being caressed by Ino's inner walls and he too was loving it. Back then Ino and him didn't see eye to eye, but that was all in the past and she did have a great deal of inner beauty to match her own outer beauty and it was something that he liked a great deal, and the feel of her cum and his own mixed together and some of it flowing down his was rather interesting for him to feel at the moment and he looked at her panting face and when she looked at him he kissed her. When they parted, the blonde Kunoichi spoke slowly and smiled all the while as she was blushing. Naruto-kun, you are so wonderful to me, I want this all to last forever. Naruto moved and helped Ino leave the open-air forge and he allowed her to relax and it was also then that he was greeted by Temari who turned him around gently but strongly and then deeply kissed him. The blonde sister of Gaara and Kankuro rubbed her body to her lover's own and the dragon champion didn't disappoint as he kissed her back and he played with her S with his hands, making her out loudly as he used his chakra to pleasure her body once more. Temari reached down and touched his slowly and rubbed it as well. As soon as that was over, the two lay down on the ground and Naruto lifted her legs to his shoulder and he smiled at Temari, wordlessly asking her permission. She smiled and spoke. Go ahead. And Naruto did just that and pushed into her vagina once more. Temari ed out loudly as Naruto was now on top of her and she felt his was now deeply inside of her body and the feel of it was very much something that she relished as he began to move. He held her legs up and with both of them together on Naruto's left shoulder, the tightness in her vagina was stronger and the pleasure was even more delicious for the both of them and that was more than enough to make the two of them very happy as the blonde Chunin started moving slowly in and out of her wet. Ah, yes, right there. The two blonde ninja began to pick up the pace as Naruto moved even faster and he used his hands and tongue to further pleasure Temari and the blonde genin of Suna was very happy with the pleasure she was receiving at this time and she would not have it replaced by anything in the world. She ed out even more as Naruto's chakra-covered hands played with her in her thighs as well as her stomach while his tongued her sensitive areas on the thighs and on the back of her knee, the same place that she knew and Naruto knew was sensitive. Yes. More. Ah. Temari-chan. The pleasure continued to grow and the two loved it even more until finally Naruto was pounding hard into Temari's vagina and the blonde Kunoichi couldn't help herself as a line of drool was going down the side of her mouth as she was enjoying the delicious sensations that were flowing all over him and it was driving her to utter joy and she saw the same expression in Naruto's face and then they both came at the very same time. Ah. Both of them screamed out their pleasure and as they felt the results, Naruto moved away and then lowered Temari's legs off his shoulders. The blonde Suna ninja couldn't help but out loudly at the feel of her lover's cum flooding her inner core and the heat coming from the thick and sweet-tasting fluids was worth very delicious in her mind as she enjoyed it as best she could. She looked at Naruto and she knew that she was blushing right now but didn't care. The only boy who was going to see this side of her personality was the handsome and well-built man before her. As for Naruto, he moved forward and kissed Temari and the blonde Sangenin kissed him right back and she then spoke to him in a very tired but utterly pleasured voice. Thank you Naruto-kun. You're welcome. Naruto moved away and it was then that he was greeted by Tenten. The weapon expert of Konoha moved on all fours towards Naruto and kissed him deeply and he replied back with the same fervor and the two of them were now kissing each other while Tenten was on top of him and enjoying the sensations that he was giving her at the moment as he reached with his hands to play with her s. As they broke the kiss, she made her move and then turned around and lowered her hips and aligned Naruto's to her dripping wet vagina and with a smile at Naruto lowered herself down and Tenten shouted as she felt her lovers go deeply inside of her easily. Ah. Both of them ed at the very same time and Naruto pushed himself upwards and was now on Tenten's back and he whispered to her. You naughty girl. Thank you. Now then, shall we? Oh yes we will. Tenten ed out loudly as Naruto began to move his hips and she felt his moving in and out of her slowly as she sat on Naruto's lap while he was behind her and busying himself by playing with her handing her neck as well as nibbling her earlobes, making her out even more in pleasure as the sensations made her smile widely at him as she turned and they kissed once another deeply. Naruto took it further and then played with her oris with his fingers gently and the pleasure that flooded Tenten was more than enough to make her shout out even more in pleasure as Naruto continued to move his hips and she moved up and down on his lap and his as well and the weapon mistress made her pleasure all the more obvious to her lover after they kissed and she shouted it all out to the air. Harder Naruto-kun. Naruto did just that and the two of them were once more covered in pleasure as Naruto played with Tenten's s and oris. Tenten ed out louder and she moved her own hips as well and the pleasure tripled in intensity for the both of them and finally the two of them reached the very apex of their limits as they both came at the very same time. Ah. Tenten relished the feel of her lover's cum flowing into her vagina and filling every corner of her body and the warmth it gave was worth every second of it all and as soon as she felt her lover's fire the last remaining streams of his cum, she turned and they both kissed one another once more and she felt the combined fluids of their bodies moving out of her and it made her all the more aroused despite the fact that she was already very tired. Naruto also felt the same way as he felt Tenten's inner walls milk his and it was delicious as he felt so relieved and the kiss between the two of them was worth every moment. Tenten was a nice person despite her pushy nature at times and she was also very capable and trustworthy in his eyes, and she had a beautiful body, and face made the picture all the more attractive to the blonde chunin. Tenten then moved off of her lover slowly and they kissed as she lay down next to him. Naruto lay down on the ground outside of his house and in his compound and was amazed that he was still very much alive and still breathing. He felt a slightly dull headache going on that was on the back of his head, but he fell asleep as the other women surrounded him and spent time to look at his sleeping form. Later, the women looked to see that it was already halfway to morning and Naruto was really out of it, but it was worth every second, every minute, and every hour. Kurenai looked at the sleeping blonde and was happy that he was still very much alive after the nearly 15-hour-long run that they had with him, and seeing him sleep buck was one of her very own guilty pleasures. There was something handsome about looking at a good-looking guy as he slept peacefully at the moment. He's looking to be very tired. The others nodded and with her superhuman strength, Tsunade lifted Naruto and brought him back to the bed and allowed him to finally get the sleep he needed greatly. The others smiled and soon got dressed and decided to return home. Each of them had very special excuses to be out so late, namely in the case for Sakura, Ino, Tenten, Ayame and Hinata. As soon as they were dressed, they each kissed Naruto goodnight and left, but not before making sure that they would not forget the incredible night for as long as they lived. As for Naruto, he was sleeping soundly and having some very interesting thoughts of his own. However, he was unaware of the fact that his antics had began to result in subtle but totally beneficial changes in the bodies of his loved ones. The mixture of chakra, both his normal chakra and that of the Kyuubi, and the dragon fire that was in his body was making its effects known to the women in a subtle way. The effects were already obvious in Sakura as she was having a slow but very strong growth spurt. But what about the effects this mixture of energy from his body and his cum have on the others such as Hinata, Ino, Tenten, Kin, Tamari, Kurenai, Anko, Tsunade, Shizune, and Ayame? Only time will tell, but one thing was for certain, it was going to be a very interesting set of circumstances. Koyuki ed as she dueled with Naruto with her tongue on his and he was showing that he was enjoying this too as she placed all her emotion and feeling into it as they kissed each other deeply and she reached out and began to remove his clothing and the princess avoided the fake bandages as well. Naruto then reached out and did the very same thing, slowly removing her dress and robe and the two of them were still kissing one another deeply. Koyuki found Naruto's taste to be very nice and despite the fact she was supposed to be acting, there was nothing fake about her kissing him as she began to get even more heated as they tasted one another and dueled one another as well. The two continued to kiss one another and the passion the two were releasing was very obvious to the director and the other film crew members and he was happy that the Konoha ninja were out on patrol and not seeing this as this was proving to be quite the scene. He could see the chemistry building between the two when they kissed slowly at first, but now, this was going to be a hot one in his mind. Naruto was finally able to strip off the upper portion of the dress that Koyuki wore and then removed the inner garment and he looked at Koyuki who had prepared in advance, and she was as he moved his arms away from her to gaze at her. Koyuki was very slender and well built for her age, not to mention that what she was not as big as the others he had already been with, her S were full and firm, filling her build and age and the S were light red, very appealing to him and the look of her body before him. Her half was very nice to his eyes, the blonde could see the deep blush on her face as well and that excited him to no end and it took a good deal of his willpower not to jump the gun like that right there and now. This scene was going to be as romantic as possible and he was going to make it so. Koyuki blushed herself as she saw Naruto's ness, or partial ness and she had very good reason after all, he was well built but not from bodybuilding or any of the sort, but through training, hard work and battles, there were a lot of strong men, that much she knew for a fact, but seeing Naruto half sent a great deal of pleasure and head into her body and she liked it as she looked at his arms, shoulders, chest, and stomach. She caught a glimpse of some sort of symbol on his stomach, but ignored it for now as she continued to examine him and she felt her body react with pleasure and heat. I never felt like this before. Naruto-kun, you have no idea what effect you have on me. I'm happy I met you. The princess was the first to move as she leaned forward and kissed Naruto once more and Naruto responded as the both of them blushed deeply as they kissed one another with a greater amount of passion and desire than before, and this was not faked, but all real and despite the fact that the two of them knew that there were cameras watching them along with people, they were too intoxicated and fixated with one another to care at all. Koyuki hugged Naruto and rubbed her S on his chest and both of them ed at the contact with one another and Koyuki felt Naruto run his hands on her back after playing with her hair. The way Naruto acted was so precise that she wondered if he had done this before, but she placed those thoughts aside as Naruto began to rub her back with his hands and she felt the sensations flood up and down her spine slowly. And she liked it as she blushed and opened her eyes and without any hesitation kisses the blonde chunin and the kiss was so powerful in terms of physical intimacy and passion that it had an effect on a good number of the people nearby as some people had to control their own breathing lest they spoiled the scene before them. Naruto and Koyuki however were in their own private littler world as the blonde chunin continued to kiss Koyuki deeply and she did the same thing as both of them blushed deeply and as the kiss got even more heated, their tongues were touching, tasting and feeling one another as if they wanted to take each other's taste deeply into their bones and keep the memories of each other deep inside of themselves. As they parted their kiss, the blonde chunin moved his hands to her S and played with her S, gently and she ed out softly at this and she blushed while running her slender hands on Naruto's back and as she brought him closer to her body, he was more than willing to let her have her own fun as she explored his body while he played with her with his hands. He knew that her had to be careful, even more so since this was Koyuki's first time with her and he took his time to tease them with his hands, and then he took it further and used his lips to pleasure her and making Koyuki out loudly at the sudden but not unwelcome blast of heat in her body. Ah! Koyuki ed out at the pleasure she was feeling, and the feeling of Naruto's hot skin on her fingers was more than enough to get her even more heated as she reached to his arms and then held his head as he'd ed and worshipped both her and The princess had never done this before in her whole life. Even when she became an actress, she had shied away from such bold and daring roles, but with this script and the fact that Naruto was the one doing this with her and not some other actor, she was more than willing to go all the way, and even if there was a chance Naruto was no longer a virgin, she was more than content as he already would know how to properly pleasure a woman. And Naruto did know as he experimented gently with his lips, tongue and teeth on how to place the best amount of pleasure for Koyuki to experience, and when he found out enough, he placed it all to good use in regular intervals, and Koyuki's and the way her blush deepened told him volumes on how he was doing at the moment, and the fact that he was making love to his favorite actress and friend at the same time is something that boggled Naruto's mind, but he focused on the pleasure he was giving to Koyuki as he moved from her right to her left to evenly distribute the pleasure that she was feeling at this moment. Ah, that's it. Feels so hot. And Koyuki felt a lot as she continued to run her hands on Naruto's hair, and she then made her way to his long ponytail and freed it, allowing the deep golden strands to be free, and she ran her hands through them and marveled at the softness there, and she smiled as she explored his strong back once more, and then she gasped as Naruto held both her and brought them together and did both her at the very same time, and she gasped at that pleasure, and when Naruto moved back, she made her own move on him and then moved forward and made him lean back, and she ran her hands on his chest, and with a very seductive action which was not in the least bit forced or pretended, she kissed his chin and nipped his nose and began to kiss his neck and then his collarbone and made her way to his chest. As soon as she was in position to make her own move, she did so and began to Naruto's chest and then his own and he gasped at that. Ah, this was not really the first time Naruto had gone through this, but it was still very exciting and pleasurable to the blonde ninja and dragon champion as he lay back and let Koyuki have her way with him for a change, and the two were getting very used to this, and Naruto then reached out to caress Koyuki's head and play with her hair as well. Koyuki ed out loudly at that and relished the feel of Naruto's skin on her tongue and the warmth of his body flowing through her tongue, as well as she continued to kiss Naruto's chest and then to the blonde's stomach, unmindful or rather unaware of the significance of the symbols on his stomach, and continued with her explorations, and then she made her way to his. And Koyuki had to admit that it was certainly impressive for his age, and that made her all the more excited. She had read this in books and had seen some movies with strong adult themes when she was older and understood what she was about to do, but that didn't stop her from developing a fierce blush on her face as she moved ever closer to her lovers and then kissed the tip gently. Koyuki then rubbed Naruto's balls gently with her hands, and in time with her kisses on it from tip to shaft, all the way to the base, and this time she decided to try using her tongue, and she couldn't help but find the heat and smoothness of Naruto's to be something she was going to enjoy for quite a bit. Naruto ed out loudly at the sensations she was giving him with her lips and her tongue as well as her hands, and he reached out and played with Koyuki's hair and did his movements slowly to make sure that he was not going to rush this. He moved his hands to her scalp and gently massaged it, using his chakra to properly stimulate her nerves. Much to her enjoyment on the matter, Koyuki increased her actions on his. The blonde chunin had no idea how he had gotten into this, but his full male side was not in the mood to care, and he was more than willing to let Koyuki go on with her action on his. As soon as she was done withing and caressing Naruto's, Koyuki took it even further and then opened her mouth and gently took in Naruto's into her mouth, past her lips, and thenning the time slowly and gently as well in order to make sure that she got it all right. She opened her mouth even more and took it in deeper, marveling at the softness, the heat, the smoothness and the hardness at the same time. It was addictive to her. Koyuki took in as much as she could, and as soon as she took in all she could handle, she relaxed herself and began to move slowly and surely, to make sure that her pace was relaxed and in good motion. This was not acting. This was real to her, and in that moment she wanted this so badly that she nearly lost her control, but thankfully she didn't and held on to her control as she took in Naruto's deeply into her mouth. Ah! Naruto was engrossed by this as Koyuki slowly began to move her head and the feel of his in her hot and wet mouth was intoxicating and powerful to his senses. He was amazed that he didn't fall over and die right there and then. But he held on and ed as he felt Koyuki move slowly as she used her tongue to stimulate the lower part of his as well as the tip, and the feeling of her cheeks rubbing the sides was so hot in his mind he was amazed that his brain was not cooking in the heat he was feeling at the moment. Koyuki relaxed herself, and while she had absolutely no idea how to do this, she was getting to learning how to do it well enough. She used Naruto's S to judge how well she was doing, and she could sense and hear that Naruto was enjoying her actions on his, and that made her smile even more in pleasure and happiness. She was a virgin, and the fact that she was making her partner be like this for her first time was very empowering and enjoyable for her. She then used her hands to play with Naruto's legs and then his chest to make her love her. Naruto responded by using his chakra-covered hands to rub Koyuki's shoulders and back, aiming for the pleasure areas of her nerves, and that was more than enough for him to make Koyuki in pleasure even more, and that was something that the two of them enjoyed immensely as well. The two continued with their actions as the rest of the camera crew looked on while the director was grinning like mad. This was not an act, it was like watching two real lovers making out with one another, and that made this whole scene even more precious and award-winning in his mind. Naruto couldn't help himself back in anymore, and he shouted his release. A-A-A-A-U-U-U-U-U-G-G-G-G-G-G-H-H-H-H-H-H. The blonde Chunin felt his release of his cum hit him like a hammer to the back of his body, but it was certainly something that he was enjoying immensely as he came fast and hard. The sensations of Koyuki's tongue still caressing his was more than enough to make him release more of his cum, and that made him all the more happy that he finally reached his limits at this exact moment. Koyuki took it in stride as she knew that it was needed, but the taste was not as bad as she had heard from other women who had done it before. In fact, Naruto's cum was rather sweet and delicious to her taste buds, and the feeling of his hot liquid in her mouth proved to be very nice and calming, almost soothing as well, and that made this moment all the more precious to her. Naruto looked on as Koyuki took in all she could, and she then moved away, and some of his cum still fired out from his now that it was released from Koyuki's mouth. Some of his cum landed on Koyuki's face and the top portions of her S, and the sight of that was very exciting to the blonde Chunin. Koyuki smiled and swallowed Naruto's seed and then used her hands to clean her face and her S, and as soon as she was done, the princess actress moved back and parted her thighs, and knew that if Naruto already had an idea on how to pleasure a woman the way a man should, then he would have no problem seeing and understanding her actions. Naruto didn't disappoint Koyuki either, as he understood but decided to have his own turn to have fun with Koyuki in a very pleasurable way for both of them. He stared by moving towards her and kissed her deeply, unmindful of the fact that he could taste himself, and then kissed her face and evened it gently, making Koyuki smile, and she ed on his tongue, turning both himself and herself on even more. The blonde Chunin then kissed his way to her neck and then to her collarbone and then back to her S, and he used his hands in order to pleasure Koyuki even more while he played with her S and S with his mouth and tongue. As soon as the blonde Chunin was able to make Koyuki and pant in bliss at the sensations on her body, he moved to her stomach and kissed his way to her navel gently and made Koyuki blush at his gentleness, and it was then that he moved to her thighs. Ah, yes. Koyuki smiled deeply as Naruto kissed her thighs, and with his hands, he touched her thighs gently, and with his chakra-covered hands touching her thighs as well. The princess actress was enjoying every moment of this as she ed out at the gentle way Naruto was pleasuring her, and she gasped as Naruto finally kissed her patch of soft hair on top of her vagina. She blushed even more as Naruto took a sniff of her scent. Naruto smelled the sweetness mixed with a slight hint of female spiciness as well. That was enough to entice him as he kissed her vagina, making the princess gasp and cry out in pleasure and surprise. Ah! Naruto smiled as he tasted Koyuki's juices and found the taste to be very nice and like a slightly strong sweet liquid, and that made him all the more eager, and he gently Koyuki's vagina, and he did it with all the knowledge that he had gained when he was with the others he had been intimate with for the past few months, and it made him happy that he knew how to pleasure a woman, and while he was sure that he was not fully aware how to fully pleasure Koyuki as he was not aware of her pleasure spots, he was more than willing to experiment. And he finds one such spot with his tongue as he'd her right thigh on a spot between her leg and her vagina, and that made Koyuki squirm and out loudly. He pleasured it a bit more, and he could see the results as Koyuki's breathing increased in her movements as well. The sight of the princess breathing even faster as well as having a beautiful blush on her beautiful face was enough to excite Naruto as he went back to her Oris in her vagina, and when he'd her Oris, Koyuki shouted in pleasure as she felt the sensations run through her nerves like deep red fire. Ah! Naruto looked up and saw the looks of love, passion, lust and desire written all over her face as well as the shine of passion in her eyes, and she ed out her approval for him to continue and continue. He did as he delved even deeper into Koyuki's vagina and then her Oris as well, and the results spoke for themselves as Koyuki was panting and ing in pleasure at the sensations that were hitting her body due to his skilled use of his tongue. Naruto-kun, ah, there, you are so good to me. More. The two were enthralled with one another and were not paying attention to anything at this moment, and that was fine for everyone as they were took engrossed in the whole thing, and the director was busy keeping track. The whole set was focused that one could hear a pin drop to the floor with the power of an explosive tag. The princess was relishing her first time, and as she looked at Naruto, who was busy making her squirm and out loudly in pleasure, and the images of him doing this to her in their own private bedroom and being able to do this every night of their lives was making her even happier, and that was a good thing in her mind. Koyuki then placed those aside as she played with her S with her own hands, and then as Naruto laved her Oris with his tongue, she gasped out even more and bit her lower lip gently to control herself from screaming out loudly. The pleasure was so real and so invigorating that Koyuki wanted this moment to last for as long as possible, and when she felt Naruto push his tongue deeply into her vagina and take in her juices deeply and hungrily, she was in heaven as the pleasure filled her to the brim, and it was not going to be long before she finally hit her limits. Ah! The princess of Snow Spring Country finally reached her release and she orgasmed hard, her very first orgasm, and it was beautiful. She felt like she was being filled to the brim with not just pleasure and joy, but also happiness. The fact that she had just felt her very first orgasm and it was given to her by someone she cared for, trusted, and owed a great deal to was something that she enjoyed even more. She could feel her juices flow out like a river, and even when she was gushing out, she saw Naruto up her juices with undisguised gusto and desire, making her all the more heated and aroused. Naruto lapped up as much of Koyuki's juices as he could manage, and the taste of her juices as well as the feel of her skin and the feelings of her soft flesh was certainly worth it all in his mind, and he looked at Koyuki and moved up, and the two of them shared yet another deep kiss with one another, and as soon as they tasted one another in their mouths, the two rubbed their bodies to one another and the pleasure grew greatly between them, and as they finally broke the kiss, the blonde Chunin moved his body closer and then positioned his right at Koyuki's wet and then looked at her with a silent question. Koyuki nodded to Naruto and Naruto blushed deeply as he positioned himself while she did the same, and she allowed him to be between her thighs and he placed her legs to his waist afterwards, and as soon as he was sure that he was in the right position and could see that she was also in a good position, he began to push his slowly into her vagina, and the feeling of being filled the brim was very much enjoyable to her, and she gasped deeply as Naruto continued to push his even deeper into her vagina, and she felt her vagina stretch to accommodate the welcome intruder into her depths. It was then that she felt Naruto's touch her barrier, the ultimate proof that she was indeed a virgin, and she gasped a bit and looked at Naruto with some concern. Naruto leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek and whispered into her ear. "I know what to do, I will do my best not to make it hurt too much, Koyuki-hime." "Thank you, Naruto-kun, make me yours now. I want this so badly." Naruto nodded and made his move as he pulled back a bit and then kissed Koyuki deeply and pushed deeply, and it was not long before the barrier gave way. Koyuki cried and Naruto took in her cry and gently pushed in until he was deep inside of her, and as he moved away, her gently kissed away Koyuki's tears and spoke loving words to her, and he also used his chakra-covered hands to caress her body and her S as well to send pleasure to banish the pain she felt. Koyuki marveled at the pleasure and bliss that flowed through her body at that moment, and as soon as Naruto was buried deeply inside of her body, she ate even more and began to feel this hunger, this need for something that she couldn't explain. She wanted something that she felt only Naruto could give, only he could release her from this desire, and she wanted it now. She wanted it as much as she could, and soon before the desire for what Naruto could do would drive her to the edge. She heard stories about this moment, how good it felt to some women while others with bad experiences involving men would say otherwise, but in her case, she was enjoying this greatly and she hungered for more, and she moved her hips to tell Naruto her desire. Naruto nodded and slowly pulled out of Koyuki's vagina. When he entered her inner sheath at that moment, It felt so hot, soft, wet, and tight that he nearly came right there and then, and he would have had he not developed a good deal of control as well as his previous experiences with the women he had already been intimate with back in Konoha. He pulled back and then when he was nearly out, he pushed gently back in with a bit more speed and the results were worth it as the pleasure raced up and down his body and all over his nerves. The same could be said for Koyuki. The moment she felt Naruto move out, she edged and tightened her grip on him with her legs, begging him not to leave, but then he pushed back in and the pleasure that ran into her body was so delicious that she couldn't help but feel even more satisfied with the sensations and she wanted more of the pleasure that Naruto was giving her at this very moment and Naruto was more than willing to do that as he moved slowly in and out of her dripping wet, tight, soft and hot vagina and she felt her inner walls milking and caressing her lovers. Naruto edged out even more and continued to move his hips slowly at first in order to make sure that Koyuki would be able to get comfortable with the movements of his in and out of her vagina and as soon as he was sure that he got the pace right for her pure enjoyment, he began to enjoy it himself as she moved in and out of Koyuki's tight, hot, wet, and soft vagina and he groaned as he felt her inner walls massage and milk his deeply. It was not long before the blonde Chunin and temporary actor began to move faster and Koyuki edged out her approval as Naruto moved deeper and harder into her vagina and the two of them were enjoying every second of this with all that they had at this moment and the blonde moved to play with Koyuki's S with his chakra-covered hands, sending more pleasure and sensation down her body and that made her even more aroused. Ah, harder, deeper. A. So good. The two were moving at a much faster pace this time and it could be seen as Naruto was now moving faster and the sounds of their lovemaking was growing in intensity and Koyuki was relishing this even more as she held Naruto and brought him to her and then the two of them kissed one another deeply while he played with her. Thanks for listening. In the next part. In the meantime, please leave a review. I would love to hear your feedback. Especially if it helps me improve the overall story.